Hello, I'm Jeff Hughes, and I'll be talking to you about bilingual education and monolingual aspirations. So my question of study is, have certain policies in the United States, such as the No Child Left Behind Act and the Bilingual Education Act, produced and/or enhanced nationalism to some degree, or do they reflect a form of ethnocentric exclusion? Now, I know this is quite the question to ask, and I don't necessarily expect to have an answer of one or the other. But I think by the conclusion you'll see that both of these are related in many ways. So framing the question, just to put it in sociolinguistics terms, language loyalty has an special importance for many countries in the world, and this is one of the concerns for sociolinguistics, so this question does fit into what we've learned in the class so far. So quick outline, although my paper does have many more fields available, including Proposition 203 in Arizona, as well as more examples of nationalism at a cultural level. I will only be focusing on these three things to make this only a 20-slide presentation. And so we'll be focusing first on Bilingual Education Act, and then No Child Left Behind, and then finally finishing up with nationalism and policy in the United States. So continuing on, the Bilingual Education Act, or the BEA, was implemented in 1968. It was an addition to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. This was also the first legislation to focus on the education of linguistic minorities, and it was supported by the senator in Texas, and this particular senator saw that on average, white Americans had 14 years of education in comparison to Mexican Americans who only had 4.7 years of education, according to the 1960 census. So this was made to confront that reality and hopefully change it. Philosophy behind the BEA, it was considered a war on poverty legislation, and it was also considered to be a crisis intervention, obviously because of the wide disparities in education between the white population and Mexican Americans. And it was also based on the cultural deprivation theory. And the cultural deprivation theory could also be the culture of poverty theory. That's just another way of saying it. And that kind of suggested that the reason why Mexican Americans were failing in school is because they lacked certain culture. And it also assumed that specific types of attitudes, language styles, work values, and other behaviors or culture dampen the abilities necessary to overcome poverty. And so in this case, it talked mostly about how it seems to be the BA was a compensatory program. Moving on, reauthorizations. The BA had 6 reauthorizations total. And this spanned from 1968 until the last one being in 1994. The early reauthorizations included putting culture in the classroom. For example, the 1978 reauthorization of the BEA had an appreciation for the native cultural heritage of students, and that's actually a direct quote from that. However, by 1984, that had changed dramatically, mostly because there was a sharp rise in immigration. In fact, there was a 63% increase from the last decade. So from 1981 to 1990, there were a total of 7.3 million immigrants that came into the country. And as a result, it seems the BEA would change to address that fear, as can be seen in the reauthorization acts, because for example, in the 1978 version, bilingual education is becoming more important, including cultural heritage of the students. And then all of a sudden in 1984, that was almost reversed. So the changes, like I noted before, the BA eventually allowed for English-only instruction. Before, the students had to be educated in their native language, but now schools were allowed to only have English-only instruction. Furthermore, the 1988 reauthorization set a time limit for education programs. Before, students could be in a bilingual education classroom for up to 7 years. But with the 1988 reauthorization, this was left to the individual schools to make their own specific time frame. And this could be 7 years, it could be a month or two, it could be 1 year. It was up to the school. So moving on to the No Child Left Behind Act. This was the spiritual successor of the BEA, and it effectively draws race-based lines and jeopardizes access to education. Or as Honer said, this is the essence of de facto discrimination, and some of these discriminatory practices were somewhat seen in the BEA as well, when they viewed that the culture of Mexican Americans was what led to them being less well educated or getting further in their education compared to white students. It also places bilingual education students in the same category as students with a disability, which I thought was very interesting because it almost seems as if they're saying not knowing English is the same as having a disability. Now I know that could be a leap in an assumption, but based on what I've seen in the evidence, that would not surprise me if that's what some people may be thinking. So moving on to the No Child Left Behind phrasing. Now this was a very curious instance, and I wanted to highlight this more than perhaps some other points, but one thing, the NCLB Title VII, which was the bilingual education, it was originally called the Bilingual Education Act, but it was actually changed to Language for Limited English Proficient and Immigrant Students. Also, the Office for Bilingual Education and Minority Language Affairs was changed to the title of Office of English Language Acquisition. So obviously it seems that there were some steps taken to completely take out the word bilingual from the NCLB, which they were successful in because no mention of the word bilingual is there. So moving on, just to conclude some of the main ideas between the BEA and NCLB. The BEA especially views certain students from other cultures as deprived, and NCLB, as I said, was a spiritual successor. So there are some similarities there, maybe not as obvious as some in the BEA, especially during the later reauthorizations of the BEA. Furthermore, both appear to value an English-only approach over bilingual education. And in fact, the NCLB only requires for students to be put in language instruction classrooms and is not required to have their native language present. So moving on for nationalism. So nationalism can be defined as an experience of national identity shared with others that is normally associated with common cultural characteristics that binds a population together. Furthermore, nationalist movements, as represented by BEA, from the examples I provided, heighten the link between language and ethnicity and use it to mobilize populations. And I believe in this case you could see that with the reauthorization of the BEA in 1984. Because of all the immigrants coming in, there were changes made to that. So the particular form of nationalism I was focused on was cultural nationalism. And in this case, it focuses more on cultural identity of people. And the people who don't share the same cultural identity as, say, the white majority in the United States, they can exclude them based on either cultural or racial reasons, and they'd be called others. And they can exclude the first-generation Americans who may have a very different culture and obvious different language. And they can also even exclude subsequent generations who somehow don't fit into the American culture. And usually that's done through either what you can see or the language that the person uses. So going on with reasons for exclusion, ethnocentric exclusion may reflect a perception among dominant groups that immigrants represent a threat to the nation. And this can be either realistic or symbolic threat. Now, depending on how much you keep up with immigration policies or immigration ideas and what people say, the realistic threat could be something like taking jobs away. More people come into the country, the less jobs are available for everyone else. And another one could just simply be the symbolic threat, which is what I think is perhaps the most prominent, and that there's a threat to some cultural aspects. There's a threat to the nationality, and that could be found with the language itself. So moving on to cultural identity, language is exploited in the construction of identities. Language is also the clearest indicator of ethnic difference, and English is used to foster an American identity more so than perhaps other things. Moving on to nationalism and policy. These are important ideas. The status of language is a construct sanctioned by law or tradition. For example, English is not the official language, but there's been so many attempts for it to become the official language. And traditionally, the American way has been to make English the national language, but to do so quietly, locally, and without fuss. And this can be seen at some statewide levels. And I think to better elucidate this point, I have a quote from Benjamin Franklin. In 1753, Benjamin Franklin voiced his concern that German immigrants were not learning English. He stated, "Those Germans who come hither are generally the most ignorant sort of their own nation. They will soon outnumber us, that all the advantages we have will not, in my opinion, be able to preserve our language, and even our government will become precarious." So obviously this is not necessarily something new. It's something that's people have been struggling, or the United States has been struggling with for a long time. And there's always been these attitudes prevalent since Benjamin Franklin. So looking at policy, what distinguishes politically motivated language planning from unguided language development is deliberate choice. And it would almost seem that the BEA and NCLB may have some language planning elements, as I have tried to provide some examples. Also, official English legislation has to do with concern about immigration, especially Hispanic immigration. And I think that has to do with the 1981 to 1990 spike in immigration, which I think was largely Hispanic. So, restatement of the question: have certain policies in the United States, such as the No Child Left Behind Act and the Bilingual Education Act, produced and or enhanced nationalism to some degree, or do they reflect a form of ethnocentric exclusion? So before I go on, I want you to maybe review some of the ideas in your head and come up with your own answer. I'll give a few seconds for you to think about those, and then I will go into what I believe are those conclusions. So you can even pause if need be. So my conclusions, based on reading through these acts as well as looking at some critical papers and ideas based on them, it seems that these acts appear to function as a defense to a very important aspect of cultural identity for Americans, and that is language. Both of these acts may even be considered language planning. As we can see, even though that English is not the official language, it can almost be seen from the reauthorizations of the BEA and some of the wording for the NCLB that bilingual education is almost no longer relevant. It almost doesn't even exist as far as NCLB goes, in part because the term was completely wiped out and replaced with trying to learn English. So I think that speaks very strongly to the whole idea of language planning. And the ramifications of these acts seem to exclude people from other cultures, especially those who have a different culture. And as I mentioned before, it seems that this is especially true for those of Hispanic descent. And so these are my references, and thank you very much.